everyone, and welcome to the Inner Athlete Training Podcast. I'm your host, James Jankiewicz, and we have another great topic for you today. We're going to go in depth into Lyme's disease with Richard Mandelbaum. Before we get started, just want to remind you to please like, subscribe, and share the content if you are getting something out of it. And that's about it for our housekeeping. So, without further ado, I want to introduce Richard Mandelbaum. Richard Mandelbaum is a RH, a registered herbalist, and has been practicing as an herbalist since 1998, with a background in both Chinese and Western herbal traditions, and a passion for our native local plants. He is a co-founder and co-director of the Arbor Vitae School of Traditional Herbalism in New York City, and is on the faculty at David Winston Center for Herbal Studies with a focus on botany and phytochemistry. Richard was a member of the board of directors of the American Herbalist Guild from 2012 to 2018, serving as secretary and as chair of the Committee for Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity. Richard embraces herbalism as an affirmation of our biome and planet, and is also active in issues related to sustainability, social justice, and fair trade. Richard, welcome to the Inner Athlete Training Podcast.
Thank you so much, James. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. And just as an aside, I've done some work with Richard. I've been on a couple of his nature walks, and he's just chock full of information. I've done a number of them, and it was just always great information. And some of them went long. I mean, some of them were like 8 hours, right? I mean, sometimes you're out there for a really long time.
Yeah, it's never long enough for me when I'm out in the woods, but a full day is a nice thing for sure.
Absolutely. So Richard, with all that background and experience, I did want to take a deep dive into Lyme's disease. And I know you've treated many people with it from an herbal perspective. I know you had it yourself for a spell. So let's start digging into it. Let's start with the basics. What is it? When somebody says Lyme's disease, what are we really talking about when we say Lyme's?
Yeah, for sure. And there's a lot to unpack there. To be specific, we're talking about a bacterial infection. So Lyme is a spirochete, which is a type of bacteria. The scientific name for the bacterium is Borrelia burgdorferi. It has been, we'll get into this, I'm sure, in our conversation, but it's been spreading over the past few decades. But it is at its heart a bacterial infection. It can go along with other co-infections, as they're called, Babesia, Bartonella, Ehrlichia being some of the more common ones, at least here where I'm located in the Northeast, but there are others as well.
So basically it's a bacteria is what's getting into you and doing all the damage, and the tick is merely the vehicle. Is that correct?
That's right. And, this to maybe start out with something quote unquote controversial, I don't blame the ticks. That's a little bit of a stretch for some folks, but the ticks are carriers. The ticks are not the origin of the disease. Just like what you said, James, it's a bacterial infection. The ticks themselves actually have to become infected with it and then pass it on. So they will, for instance, suck the blood from a rodent, for example. The white-footed mouse is one of the most common vectors. And then if they pick up that infection, they will pass it to whoever's next that they attach themselves to, whether that is you or a deer or anything else for that matter. So yeah, the ticks are the primary vector, but they're not the origin of it.
So speaking of origin, let's go back a little bit further. I remember as a child, we were informed about ticks. If you see one, take it off you. Right. But that was it. We were never told anything about Lyme's, and we're going back to like the 70s and the 80s. And I did spend a disproportionate amount of my youth in woods. Right. So, but it was never a concern. And then you get into the later 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, and it really started becoming a thing. So can you give us a little background on the history of it?
Absolutely, and I agree with you. Anecdotally, same thing. I grew up in the Northeast and still live in this region, and I see a big difference myself. Other people report the same thing, and there's actually a fair amount of literature in especially in the ecological literature, there's been a lot published about Lyme. I think both Lyme and ticks are more prevalent than they used to be. Now, why would that be? There are a lot of theories. At the end of the day, I think we can't say with certainty. I like to be humble about all things related to Lyme, both as a practitioner as well as how we understand it. That said, there is a fair amount of pretty good evidence that, if nothing else, climate change is a major factor exacerbating both the population of ticks and the spread of Lyme disease. Is it the only factor? Perhaps not, but I think there's pretty good evidence that the spread of ticks, as well as the spread of Lyme disease along with that, is one of the many things that we're doing to ourselves through climate change, unfortunately.
Would industrialization play a role as well, like the mauling and the suburbanization?
Very good point. Absolutely. So the change in habitat. So, for instance, I mentioned the white-footed mouse. A lot of people, when they think about Lyme disease, they think about the ticks, of course, and then they think about deer. And we refer colloquially to the ticks that are the main species that carry Lyme. Again, I'm speaking mostly to the East Coast where I live of the US, but as deer ticks, quote unquote, they're actually more formally known as black-legged ticks. And in fact, deer are vectors of Lyme, but it's actually the white-footed mice that are the predominant species that pass Lyme on. And those are a species of rodent that thrive in disturbed habitats, kind of on edges, just like you're pointing out with suburbanization, with loss of wilderness. They thrive kind of on the edges of the disturbed ecosystems. And who's disturbed those? It's predominantly us, right? It's human beings. And so it's that those changes in ecosystems and habitats have definitely contributed as well. And just to kind of follow that thread, if I can for a second, there are all these unintended ecological consequences that have occurred that kind of cascade from actions we've taken as a species. So, for example, that white-footed mouse as a rodent, one of the reasons it's thriving is because it has fewer predators. One of its predominant predators, just as an example, are foxes. Well, there are fewer foxes here in the Northeast because there are more coyotes than there have been historically. And coyotes outcompete foxes. Where there are coyotes, there are going to be fewer foxes. Why are there more coyotes? Because we got rid of the wolves. There used to be wolves here in the Northeast. They used to take care of the deer population, help control it. And they also used to keep coyotes out. Coyotes were never in the northeastern North America until wolves disappeared. So we work backwards from that. We get rid of the wolves, the coyotes come in, they get rid of the foxes, and boom, we have this overpopulation of white-footed mice, along with, as you're saying, the habitat destruction and development and suburbanization, and then you throw climate change on top of that. And those to me seem like the primary reasons that we're probably seeing such a strong rise in Lyme disease over the past few decades.
What do we know about the bacteria itself or the spirochete? Has that been with us forever?
Oh, it sounds like a simple question, right? But you've kind of hit on a very interesting question that we don't know the answer to. And again, I think all things Lyme for myself, I try to remain humble, and I look at people who give definitive answers to these questions, and I think, well, not so fast. And there are people who, there's a bit of a debate. There are people who think Lyme perhaps has always been with us, but our immune systems are so compromised by modern lifestyle and contaminants, environmental pollution, et cetera, that perhaps we're more susceptible to it than we were in the past. Maybe it's not new as much as us getting sick from it is new. You can go the other route, and you'll find things on the internet about this being released from military establishments and that kind of thing. I don't That's not where my mind goes with it, but
Right.
you'll find everything across the spectrum that way. I do think that there is an important point within that question, which is, from everything I've seen working with Lyme for a while now, I do think there's an important question to be asked, which is, at what point does the infection matter versus how your immune system responds to it? Just like so many things, COVID over the past year, flu, you and I could run down the list, right? But it's almost never just a question of, oops, you had bad luck, you got infected. It's almost always a question, to some degree, sometimes it's to a small degree, sometimes to a large degree, but it's almost always a question of how resilient and strong is your immune system when you get infected, and do you get sick or not? And that there are so many fundamental questions about Lyme that we have no answers to, that often even the questions don't get asked, which, for instance, like you're asking, how long has it even been here? We don't know. There's some evidence from archaeological findings that it's been around for thousands of years, but that's also a bit of guesswork and hypothetical, but it's possible. But also, again, the question of perhaps we're just getting sicker from it than we used to. And I see it in my own practice that almost always when someone gets sick from Lyme, I won't say always every single time, but almost always, the majority of times for sure, somebody's going through something difficult when they get sick with Lyme, that they've had something difficult or challenging happening to them in their lives. That was true for me personally. And again, I'm not going to say it's true in every single case, but when does our immune response become suppressed, become weakened? When are we more vulnerable? And we don't even know, for instance, James, how many people might be infected with Lyme but never get sick, because we only test people who feel sick.
That's interesting. Right? So we don't have a standard test for Lyme, or people don't voluntarily go and get tested for it.
Well, exactly, right. Because, and there's some rationale for this, like, a doctor's not going to approve a test for no reason, and that would cost a lot of money. But what we've never had, for instance, is somebody to fund a study saying, well, let's go out and test 60,000 people. I'm just making up a number here, but a good high cohort number, 60,000 people for Lyme. Let's see who tests positive and who tests negative. And of course, the tests are far from perfect, and we can dig into that separately, but putting that aside for the moment, and let's follow those people for 20 years and let's see who gets sick. And I would not be surprised, from everything I've seen from Lyme, if a good percentage of people who are infected in a technical sense don't actually symptomatically get sick. And again, we know this is true of COVID, of the flu, of many other infections. It's a confluence, kind of a perfect storm of things that happen, some things being stronger than others in terms of infections. But we don't even have that basic data of what percentage of people who are infected and test positive actually get symptomatically sick from Lyme. Because again, the only time people get tested is when there's a suspicion of Lyme to begin with, which means somebody in most cases is already feeling some kind of symptom.
We even had the same phenomenon in the 80s and 90s with HIV, right? Not everybody who was found to have HIV was coming down with full-blown AIDS, right? So I remember that chapter in our history very clearly. So yeah, and you don't know what you get tested for, right? I mean, you go and just get a test. I mean, you might have all sorts of viruses up in there that you didn't even realize, but to your point, you're keeping them at bay because your lifestyle is pretty much intact for the most part.
That's right. And so I see that a lot as a practitioner because even though I'm a more holistic, natural remedies-based practitioner, I work with lab work and blood work and all of that as well. And, somebody will come to me and say, oh my God, I have Epstein-Barr. It's like, well, probably most of us do.
Right.
So it's not the presence of the virus. In that case, Epstein-Barr is a virus. That's the issue. It's if your immune system is overreacting and you're in an inflammatory state and you're getting sick from that. And that kind of gets to Lyme too, which is a bit of a different take and approach I have on it from some other folks that are out there, which is at least when it becomes chronic. So I'm not talking about, you just got bitten by a tick 2 weeks ago, that kind of scenario. That might be a bit of a different scenario, but I work with a lot of people who have chronic Lyme who maybe have been misdiagnosed for years. They come to me, it's been 8 years, 9 years. They were told this and that, nobody found anything. And then somebody, eventually figures out it's Lyme. That's a pretty difficult and challenging scenario to work with. And what I share with people in that kind of situation is look, my goal isn't even to eradicate the Lyme. Usually people walk in the door because we're all kind of indoctrinated with this idea of kill the infection, destroy it, get it out of my body. That's the problem, is I got invaded, right? And I need to push the enemy out. And that's there's some value in that approach, but it's a limited value. And there's not even any way definitively that we can prove that we have eradicated Lyme from someone's body. So for me, the approach is really, how do we get you well? How do we get you feeling well again, emotionally, mentally, physically? Let's put to the side that kind of military model of let's kill the bacterium and destroy it and get it out of me, because we can't even prove that that's possible, and we can't prove that we've achieved it.
And getting the person well is, and I don't know where you stand on this, but that's sort of consistent with the terrain versus germ theory.
Exactly.
Right. Is it internal? Is it the host, or is it the invading factor?
That's exactly right, James. Yeah, you hit it right exactly on spot. And there's a little bit of truth to both, right? Because there is an argument to be made, and there is a validity to an approach in certain cases to be on the quote unquote attack mode. And when I work with people with Lyme, that is part of the approach. But I'll tell you, if that's all you do, if you just attack, that person's going to just become more and more depleted and never get well. And any symptomatic relief is going to be fleeting and temporary. And, I see sometimes there are doctors with, I think, good intentions, but will pummel people with antibiotics, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, IV antibiotics. And you just see the person getting more and more depleted because they're not nourishing that person's health. They're just attacking.
So I want to walk through treatments, both traditional and I guess non-traditional, we would call them, and how you would particularly work with somebody. But just want to backtrack for 1 second when we were talking about the origins. And there is when you mentioned about the military, right, there is a hypothesis out there for the audience who might not know that part of it, and we don't know if it's true. Maybe it is, maybe it's a bunch of bunk, who knows? But the coincidence, however, as I recall it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because it blew up in Lymes, Connecticut, right, which happened to be right across the river from Plum Island, which was where they were where the military was doing a lot of experimentation on types of bacteria in germ warfare. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, that's my understanding. And I'm not the person to speak to about the details about that, but yes,
me neither, but I just want to give context to that idea, that's where people are making that leap, that because those two things doesn't mean it happened, but that's why people are sort of like pursuing that as a possible theory.
For sure. And my own feeling about that is, how do I know, right? Like that certainly, there could be something to that. There might not. Certainly before humans had any technological capacity to manipulate microorganisms. These diseases have been with us in the past, right? Unless there was a time machine, nobody went back and created the bubonic plague, for
Right.
example, and wiped out a third of Europe. Now, is that part of the history of Lyme or COVID, for that matter? How do I know, right?
Right.
But this is part of our world too, that these things do happen.
Right. And it doesn't change the fact that you still have to deal with it. So
absolutely,
regardless.
Yeah.
So let's go into that a little bit now. So walk us through what does traditional medicine offer? Like what are the go-to remedies for most people? And then please walk us through how you, as an herbalist with a lot of experience in this area, would then walk somebody through the same experience.
Yeah. So with mainstream medicine or conventional medicine, it's a one-trick pony, James. I'm exaggerating slightly, but it's basically antibiotics, and that's what you got. And you open up the toolkit, and there's one tool inside. It's like if you have your tools for weekend projects or fixing something up around the house, and you only have a hammer and nothing else. It's like, and that's, I mean, there are anti-malarials come into play sometimes, particularly with Babesia, et cetera, but pretty much it's a one-trick pony. And, I will say, and this is something that not everyone in the holistic or alternative world agrees on, I do think, all things being equal, if you catch the infection early, like if you have a strong suspicion that you've been infected with Lyme in the past few weeks or maybe even a month or two, I think there's an argument to be made for 3 or 4 weeks of antibiotics. And you can couple that with nourishing foods and rest and herbs and all those other things. But beyond that, that's where that calculus really changes. And like I mentioned earlier, I'll sometimes work with people who've been getting pummeled with antibiotics, for months and months and months, and it's so depleting and counterproductive over the long term, in my opinion. So that's really where we can come in, and we can do quite a lot. And like I mentioned, I find that in many cases, at least, when somebody gets sick from Lyme, they're going through something difficult. They haven't been taking care of themselves. It might not be their fault. That's not a judgment I'm trying to make, but they haven't been sleeping well, or they're going through something difficult. They've had a loss in their life, or something traumatic has happened. From my own experience, this is anecdotal, of course, but my dad passed away soon before I became sick with Lyme, and that's just one person's story, my own, but I see that repeated a lot. So the point is, we build the health back up. So we've got a lot of remedies and approaches we can use. And one thing I'll say is, with Lyme and the co-infections, because we're not talking as much about those, but you do have to pay attention and trying to ascertain if those are present as well, because they can change your approach to things. But there's an aspect to remedies that have a specificity to tamp down the population of the bacteria. My approach, if somebody's early on in infection versus chronic Lyme, is a little bit different. Again, if it's long-standing, I put aside the goal of getting rid of it, quote unquote. We're really about getting you well. But that said, I kind of look at that point as, let's reframe things and consider Lyme perhaps as part of your microbiome, right? We're all talking about the microbiome these days, as we should. What if this particular species, Borrelia burgdorferi, is now part of your microbiome? The problem is it's acting up and your immune system is responding to it, not necessarily that it's present. So let's regulate your immune response. Medicinal mushrooms are incredibly helpful. Anti-inflammatory herbs like Baikal skullcap, turmeric. There's others. Licorice can be helpful for certain folks as well. To reduce the inflammatory immune response, omega-3s in the diet, as well as supplementing potentially, can be incredibly important. And there is a place for herbs that are antimicrobial in nature. And I kind of look at it as, okay, if this is now part of your microbiome, you've got a roommate and your roommate's not behaving themselves. They're leaving all the dishes unwashed. They're not paying their part of the rent, right? They're misbehaving and causing trouble. So you have to get that under control. So there's a role to be played for those antimicrobial herbs, some of which I'm sure you're familiar with, whether it's Japanese knotweed or andrographis or cat's claw. And then there's a role for ones that are more nourishing in their nature. One of the herbs that I find incredibly helpful in a gentle way for a lot of people is sarsaparilla smilax, which is an herb that's native to Mexico and the Caribbean. Historically, it was used to treat syphilis, and as it turns out, syphilis is also a spirochete, shares some similarity to Borrelia burgdorferi, the bacterium that causes Lyme. And a lot of those herbs that actually were used as anti-syphilitic remedies are useful for Lyme. And sarsaparilla is interesting because it has that specificity, but it also is adaptogenic. So it's nourishing to adrenal function, to our hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So restoring energy levels in a healthy way, not a metabolically stimulating way like caffeine. And it's also anti-inflammatory and it helps support detox pathways. So that's another thing that can be really important in working with people.
You mentioned the term adaptogenic. Can you elaborate on that for people who might not understand what that is in the herbal world?
Absolutely, sure. So, an adaptogen, it's a term that's about 100 years old or so now. It was coined in Russia. It didn't originally refer to herbal remedies, but pretty much now it's used specifically to refer to herbal remedies, although I think of a lot of things as potentially adaptogenic. And I'll give you the big broad definition I use first and then get a little more technical. The big broad definition I like to think about is that these are remedies that support our innate adaptive capacity and resiliency. So if you think about it, being able to roll with the punches, being able to bounce back, being able to respond to stressors and make it through in a healthy way is actually an integral part of life, right? In many ways that distinguishes what's alive from what's not alive is that we're constantly adapting and responding to what's going on in our lives mentally, emotionally, and physically. We're not static, right? We're actually never stable, if you will. We're actually constantly changing, but what we want to achieve is a harmony where we have an outward stability by inwardly adapting and responding and changing. And that's in small ways and in big ways. Even if I go from a sitting position to a standing position, my blood pressure has to suddenly shift to respond to that. So we're constantly adapting. And that's what defines our resiliency. And so adaptogens are remedies that support that innate adaptive capacity and resiliency that
on a biochemical level you're speaking to, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. So getting more technical, what they do is, among other things, but the main thrust of it is they help support our hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, what's sometimes referred to as our HPA axis. So this refers to the hypothalamus deeper in our brain, the pituitary gland, which sits at the base of our brain and is the kind of master gland, if you will, of our endocrine activity. So our adrenal activity, our blood sugar, our blood pressure regulation, our sex hormone regulation, cortisol, et cetera. And adaptogens tap into that, particularly the HPA, meaning that link with the adrenal glands, production of cortisol, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, and keep that at a well-regulated state in which that balance we have in our autonomic nervous system activity between that fight or flight mode we can be in, that stimulated sympathetic mode we can be in, or that calmer rest and digest parasympathetic mode are in balance with each other. We need both, right? But what we need is to be able to kind of slip easily and smoothly from one to the other as appropriate, depending on what's going on at a given moment. And that can break down, and then we become adrenally fatigued and eventually adrenally exhausted.
So if you even had the right, let's say, combination of all the perfect adaptogens, you consume them, you still might be, are you still at war in a way? Like, let's say you're still in a highly stressed, like over emotional state for whatever reason, whatever thing may be occurring in your life. You're saying even in that hyper emotional, highly stressed state, the adaptogenics will help force the biochemistry, if you would, into a more relaxed state than you might be able to do through relaxing on your own. Do I have that correct?
Absolutely. And it's not either or. You have to do both, right?
Sure.
So there's no herb in the world that's going to replace sleeping well, right? But there are herbs that will help you to sleep well, right? So it's about potentiation and things working together in a synergistic way, right? So meditation, I consider personally to be adaptogenic, even if most herbalists won't describe it that way. I do. And guess what? You can use herbs along with a meditation practice to potentiate that and actually get more from it. So it's an all of the above strategy, and these are remedies, whether they're mushrooms, plant-based botanical remedies that we've co-evolved with for not thousands, but really millions of years. So our bodies know that chemistry, know that phytochemistry and microchemistry, and respond to that. It can be, interestingly, it can be both gentle and effective at the same time. Which sounds like a contradiction, because in the pharmaceutical world, usually you're either potent or weak, right? Gentle but effective is a category that, when we're working with natural approaches to health, we can really, I think, ought to be striving for most of the time, at least.
Right. So that makes sense. So I see the theme of coexistence in everything you're saying. The coexistence of the bacteria, even though it may be toxic, living in harmony with the body in some sense, and the coexistence with the herbs helping you kind of relax and help complement your own parasympathetic nervous system. So walk us back into the Lyme world then, and how would you apply some of that strategy to people who might have Lyme?
For sure. Yeah, let's dig into that. And just to respond to what you just said, like, let's not over romanticize things either. Just to be clear,
okay.
I use a natural tick repellent. My family and I do tick checks at the end of every day, sometimes twice a day. That's actually your best protection. Like, let's not romanticize this. We want to try to avoid this as best we can.
Right. We don't want to go out and grab a tick or a Lyme tick and say, let me see if I could coexist with this. I gotcha.
Yeah, exactly. We can take that too far, but that said, so there are, it's interesting, because when I work with someone with Lyme, every situation is a bit different. There are certainly remedies, dietary, lifestyle, herbal, that overlap in many cases. But I would say to folks, and I know this sounds a little self-serving, but I would say to folks who are listening to this, if you or someone you know is really suffering from Lyme, it's at a certain point, it's no longer a DIY project, right? Like, you want to get help and guidance, and even somebody who's experienced, it can be too much of a challenge to try to treat yourself. You want to get help from someone who has experience with that, and that's one piece of advice I would definitely give, because there's not one single thing with Lyme that is going to be correct for everybody out there. So I just want to mention that.
And before we even go a little deeper into where you're going with this, let's just back it up for a second, and let's just talk about what are the basic symptoms that may make you think you have Lyme's, and let's talk about the bullseye mark that seems to occur on some people, but not all.
Yeah, for sure. And that might bring us to testing a little bit too, because there can be a misconception out there that there are certain things that are definitive in terms of a thumbs up or thumbs down as to whether you have Lyme or not. And in fact, there's no single thing, whether it's blood work or the bullseye rash, that will tell you definitively. What I like
Really, there's no Lyme's test per se.
there are tests certainly, but they're far from perfect.
I see.
And so what I like to tell people is, it's never 0% or 100% that you have Lyme or not. It's always between 1 and 99, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. And as you're trying to navigate that difficult situation. And unfortunately, there are a lot of doctors out there, including in our region of the Northeast. You would think they would be more knowledgeable about Lyme. Some of them are, some of them aren't, and they do sometimes look at it as a thumbs up or thumbs down situation, and that's unfortunate, because that's not really. It's more detective work than that. You're picking up clues and you're determining what's most probable. So in terms of symptoms, you're right. You can get a what's called erythema migrans, or a bullseye rash that kind of spreads out from the tick bite, but that's not definitive. Many people who are infected with Lyme do not get that at all. Sometimes stiff neck, headaches, shoulder pain can come on early. Bell's palsy, in my case, that's what happened. It's not uncommon early on in the Lyme infection to occur, but again, certainly far from universal. And of course, some of the things that are well known about Lyme, like arthritic symptoms, which don't always happen right away. Sometimes people will get flu-like symptoms and then it kind of fades away, get a high fever that then fades. The joint pain could come months later. It doesn't necessarily manifest right away. And the blood work that you get, the standard tests, there's a lot of alternative tests out there, and there are a lot of tests you can, if you're financially able to pay out of pocket, that you could add to. A lot of the people I work with aren't able to do that, so they're going to tap into what's covered by insurance. Mainly test for antibodies. So they're testing for your immune system response. There are PCR tests that look for the bacterium itself. Those have their own limitations, but the most standard tests are the ELISA test and then the Western blot, and those are looking for antibody responses. And particularly early on in an infection, they can come back as false negatives quite readily. And a good doctor will determine if despite what the test says, there's a likelihood you have Lyme, they're going to talk to you about that. Other doctors, unfortunately, will get the test results back and it says negative for Lyme, and they'll say, oh, you don't have Lyme, even if that's not necessarily the case. So the tests have a role, and they do have a value. I do recommend people get tested. I recommend they get the full Western blot results. They don't, if somebody tells me, oh yeah, the doctor's office called, they said I don't have Lyme, it's like, no, that is not good enough. I want to actually see. I want them to send me those test results so I can look at them in detail.
Is the Western blot test one of the ones that's covered by insurance?
Generally, yes. Sometimes doctors will just order the ELISA, which is an immunoassay test, sort of the big, broad antibody assay, and only if that's positive, they'll move on to the Western blot. But I usually recommend to people, like, to just do your best to assert yourself and demand that Western blot from the out of the gate if you have a suspicion you have Lyme, and get the full results back. And they come in the form of different bands. They're actually blots on blotting paper, and some labs will even show you that. And but get the actual results of which bands are positive, negative, or indeterminate, and that can be very helpful, because again, something could be indicative of the possibility of Lyme without reaching the threshold that the CDC guidelines would tell a doctor is Lyme. So they might, in that case, tell you, nope, you don't have Lyme. And well, maybe you do actually. And it takes a bit of a more nuanced view.
And how frequently is the PCR test used for Lyme?
Not often, because that's usually not covered by insurance. And again, there's some alternative tests too. And there's also other labs like Igenix out in California. Stony Brook is another one. And I'll direct clients of mine to those. That said, if they're out-of-pocket expenses, let's say, James, somebody is financially, not even necessarily poor, but they don't have unlimited resources. At a certain point, spending $600-700 on repeated testing versus spending that money on good food and herbs that they need, I'll help somebody navigate through that. And sometimes, repeated testing is not what makes the most sense. It all depends on the scenario. But the bottom line being, tests are a tool, and you need to learn how to use that tool versus seeing it as the end all be all, which it's definitely not.
The bullseye rash that you get, we discussed that before, not everybody gets it. Is it possible to have that bullseye rash but not have Lyme's?
Well, there are other things that can cause similar types of rashes, but it's about kind of clues. So if you live in an area where Lyme is prevalent, and you tell me, you got a bullseye rash and you're also feeling a little stiff in the neck, and it's about putting these things together. So the bullseye rash is a pretty good indicator, which would make me think of Lyme, but it's putting it into context about what else is going on as well.
I remember working as a nutritionist and a personal trainer with a lot of clients. There was a handful I had that suffered from chronic fatigue, and it was very hard for them to get any kind of diagnosis from the doctor. This goes back, well into the 90s. And I'm just trying to think in retrospect now how much of that could have possibly been Lyme's, completely undiagnosed. They were tested for Epstein-Barr. They were tested for cytomegalovirus and that kind of thing. And as you know, that was very stigmatized back in the day. The doctors were like, well, it's not part of our medical canon, so we're not going to really bother with it. So it's all in your head, right? So, and unfortunately, these people were very dismissed. But I remember seeing the impact, that just even a mild physical exertion would have on them. And yeah, I wonder that in retrospect, how much of that could have just been misdiagnosed as Lyme's.
Completely. And the overlay between chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, same thing. I see a lot of interplay too, if people might have Lyme, but also some heavy metal toxicity, which is common. Also maybe some mold toxicity. That's where it can get challenging and tricky, because these things, it becomes a perfect storm. It's not just one thing, but how these things are interplaying with each other can play a big role too. But absolutely, there's still so much dismissiveness even about Lyme itself. The CDC still doesn't recognize chronic Lyme, and their official position is if you've been treated with antibiotics, you don't have Lyme anymore. Put that out of your head. You've got something else. And,
interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so there's still quite a lot of dismissiveness out there. That's a huge challenge. And folks I work with, especially again the people who've been suffering from it for a while, one of the things that's so important in the healing process is just to be affirming and accepting. And that can be powerful and important on the path to healing in and of itself, is to finally find a space where people aren't, just in a white coat dismissing you, and
sure.
That said, there's a lot of good doctors out there too, but not enough of them. not enough, and there can be that arrogance and that dismissiveness, and that's really tough. And you're suffering, and you're told, well, you don't have anything, or here's an antidepressant, that's all you need, or other things with Lyme we haven't even started to get into, is there can be a profound effect on someone's cognitive health, on someone's emotional health, There's the stress of the disease itself, but then there are also things that I'm convinced that the bacterial infection causes more directly in terms of effects on our mind. And if all of that is dismissed, somebody, goes to the worst place, like we all would, in terms of, am I going crazy and what's going on? And I even know of one case, James, where an older woman who had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's was given antibiotics for a completely different reason. I forget the details. She had strep or something like that, and suddenly her mind was cleared up. It turned out she had Lyme all that time. So it gets missed quite a lot, for sure.
So you would absolutely recommend both the Western blot and the ELISA test, correct? And both of those are covered by insurance?
Generally, yes. Again, the standard is to do an ELISA first, and if that's positive, you follow up with the Western blot. But I will usually tell people, just tell your doctor, look, just let's not mess around here. Just order both right off the bat, because the ELISA is too unreliable, and the Western blot will give you more detailed information. And yeah, and there's certainly stories I could tell of specific people who, had to unfortunately assert themselves and got test results back where it was incredibly clear that yes, there's definitely an infection here. In other cases, it's more ambiguous. Like I said, it can be in the gray zone a lot of times too, and that can be trickier to work with.
And Richard, can that bacteria cross the blood-brain barrier?
Well, it's not recognized too. Does it? Is there something we don't know? I think there's interesting research going on about the blood-brain barrier, because I'm sure you're aware of this, James. We call it the blood-brain barrier, but it's not a barrier. If it was a full-on, steel wall, we'd be dead. Things have to pass,
right.
but it's less permeable than other parts of our body, right? So it's not really a barrier. It's just the permeability is lower. But there are things, just like things that can affect our gut permeability, the permeability in our blood vessels, in our lungs. Things can affect the blood-brain permeability too. And are there things that make it more possible for bacteria like Borrelia to pass through than have been recognized scientifically? I certainly hold that out as a possibility. What I do know is that it certainly affects our minds. That could be in indirect ways. We know our microbiome affects our mind through vagus nerve stimulation and impact, and it could be through those kinds of mechanisms as well that Lyme does that.
And talk a little bit about the co-infections that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, sure. So there are quite a few, and these things are spreading, right? Lyme itself is spreading. I've had clients in parts of the country where they were told, you don't have Lyme. Lyme's not here. It turns out they did. And some of the co-infections are also spreading. So we've got, for instance, Rocky Mountain fever spreading on the East Coast, which we never used to have to worry about. But the main ones, the primary ones that are most common, are Babesia, Bartonella, and Ehrlichia. And those can be important tests for, pay attention to, although again, the tests, just like with Lyme, are far from perfect. So sometimes it's just a matter of more clinically assessing, does it seem like someone's experiencing the symptoms related to these? And I'll give you an example with Babesia, for instance. Babesia is a plasmodium. It's not a bacterium. It's actually related to malaria. And it has malaria-like symptoms where people will have alternating fever and chills, for instance. And if that's a part of the symptomology that someone is going through, just like herbs that have an anti-syphilitic activity can be helpful for Borrelia, for Lyme. If Babesia is present, there are herbs like Artemisia annua, sometimes called sweet Annie, which can be really effective for its anti-malarial activity in the presence of Babesia. So they can impact. In my opinion, they don't wholesale change the approach, but they can impact and make you realize to adjust the approach with somebody to make it more effective.
So then if somebody approaches you and let's say they had both the ELISA and the Western blot test and they say, Richard, like, let's assume I have this at this point. They got the rash, they got every single sign that would indicate it. Then what kind of protocol or what kind of suggestions would you make at that point? I mean, I know it's complicated and it's bio-individual and
Sure.
I understand that, but generally speaking, like what would be the next approach?
Sure. Yeah. Two things off the bat, which I think you'll appreciate, James. I'm going to make sure they're sleeping well and they're digesting well. Because if gut health isn't there, so you are what you eat, but you also are what you absorb, right? So eating healthy food, and we could get into the specifics. I mentioned omega-3s earlier. There's other stuff we could get into, but let's just for the moment say like eating a good, healthy, whole food diet, and that's appropriate for that person, an anti-inflammatory diet that's right for that person is crucial. And making sure gut health is there and working on that if you need to, because somebody's not going to recover from being ill if they're not eating well and their body's not utilizing those nutrients. And secondly, resting well. And if some, as is often the case, like we were talking about earlier, if somebody's adrenally exhausted and suffering from ongoing fatigue, they need to rest up. And we have this pathological relationship with sleep in our culture, where people will say, "Oh, I sleep 6 hours a night. I'm good." It's like, well, no, that's probably not enough, even in the best of circumstances. Forget about it if you're sick. You need to rest. You need to take care of yourself, and you need to get outside and walk, but you need to do it commensurate with how you're feeling. It may take time before you build back up. So there are all these, for lack of a better word, lifestyle things that I think are crucial actually before you get to the nitty gritty of what herbs do I take, right? If you just jump to that and ignore that other stuff, you might make someone feel better in certain ways, but if someone's in a pretty depleted state, to get back to really feeling well in a deeper way, it's going to take work and perseverance and paying attention to all the fundamentals like that, because without that, you're never going to really get there. So got to pay attention to all that. From there, you can get more specific. Elevating body temperature using saunas, for example, or something similar can be really helpful. That's a proven approach as an adjunct for Lyme. And then what I like to do is have the nourishing, building, revitalizing herbs, those adaptogenic herbs that are appropriate for that person. Those medicinal mushrooms are key that we mentioned earlier. But then when I first start working with someone, if they're in a state where they're able to do this, I will do, let's say, a 6 or so week protocol of rotating herbal formulas to get that spirochete under control. To again, using the metaphor of a roommate who's not behaving themselves, to kind of lay down the law a little bit and say, hey, behave yourself. And then we keep working with the nourishing, and that 6 weeks might not be enough. But generally, if you're on the right approach, that's enough time to at least be able to assess if you're on the right track or not. And then, but somebody who comes to me who's been dealing with this for years and years, it might take a year of work or longer to really feel well again. It can be a slog depending on what state somebody's in when they first come to me.
Is there an average period of time that it would take somebody coming to see you or somebody taking a more naturalistic approach to get over, or even if they just go with the antibiotic approach? Like, is there a sort of a general average cycle that it takes people to get over?
No.
Okay.
No, I won't even try to answer that because every situation is so different. And again, if somebody's generally healthy, resilient, got those fundamentals in place, they sleep well, they're paying attention to health, they're physically active, they're eating well, All of that stuff's in place. But yeah, they had that bad luck of getting infected with Lyme. You know, and it's been pretty recent that they were infected. They might be able to bounce back. I mean, some people just take the antibiotics and get better, to be honest with you. Um,
I've seen
and
that.
yeah, yeah. So the earlier you catch it, the more likely that is to be the case. But the more depleted somebody is when that happens to them, and the longer it's been since that's happened, uh, it can be a slog. It can be months. It can be a year or longer. And I've seen everything in between.
Would it be prudent to take the antibiotic as a preventative? Let's say you were camping and you're just not sure, and you can't exactly be the contortionist you once were to see every nook and cranny on your body, and you don't have somebody to help
Yeah.
scope you out. So is it a good preventative? And to that end, the other part of the question too is, are there more natural things you could take that to help boost it too? Like if I take
Yeah.
a bunch of echinacea after I get out of the woods, is that going to help with Lyme specifically?
Yeah, no, great questions. First off, on the antibiotic front, my answer to the scenario you just painted is no. Like we'd all be taking antibiotics too often if we did it purely preventively. That's not a good idea. That said, it could be a rational decision if somebody has a strong suspicion of, I was camping alone, so nobody could, look at my lower back and realized, oh, I did have a deer tick on me. First of all, if you, learn what a black-legged or deer tick looks like versus other types of ticks, and you can also, if you do find a tick on you that's been there for a while, send it off to a lab to be tested to see if it's
Mm.
infected. So those are all good ideas as well. But there are there are doctors who increasingly, in some cases like that, will give you a single dose of, say, doxycycline, just one single dose. But purely preventively, you're not feeling a thing. You're just worried about it in a general way. Uh, yeah, I think we'd be taking antibiotics way too often if we started doing that.
Right,
So
because you don't
I
want the
yeah.
person who's doing yard work every Saturday to take it as a preventative, right?
No, no.
So
The negatives of antibiotics begin to really outweigh the
sure,
positives
long
if you
term, yeah.
overdo it, as we know. There are definitely some negative consequences. That said, if you're putting those clues together and you're starting to realize like, oh, I found a tick on me that had been there for a while. Maybe you sent it off to a lab, it came back positive. Maybe you have a stiff neck or your fever spiked or something like. Well, okay, maybe that's enough now to put that together and do that, make that decision, right? So that's kind of the difference there. In terms of herbally, to your point, there are things. The most fundamental thing is nourish your immune system. I mean, you and I were talking about this earlier before you started recording in relation to COVID, right? Like, regardless of what else we think about what's going on, let's just realize the need to nourish our immune systems, not stimulate it, but nourish it in a deeper way, right? And so keeping your immune system strong by how you live is your best protection, to be honest, apart from the natural tick repellents and the tick check. That said, there are herbs like astragalus and medicinal mushrooms that will strengthen that immune response in an ongoing way. These are not stimulants to your immune system. So these are things you do, daily or close to daily, that over time cumulatively improve your immune response. So sometimes I'll tell people, hey, you're worried about Lyme during tick season. Do astragalus daily, as a decoction or as an extract. In terms of herbs and natural remedies that more stimulate the immune response, like you mentioned, echinacea, elderflower might be another one, boneset might be another one. Yeah, those are not bad ideas if you have a little bit of an inkling of like, I wonder, I don't have a strong reason to think I got infected with anything, but I'm a little bit worried about it because I was camping, as you pointed out, and there were lots of ticks. And yeah, no harm done doing a little bit of immune boosting for a week or 10 days afterwards.
But that's what you mean by the nourishment versus a stimulant, right? Because something like echinacea, you don't want to take daily. You just want to cycle it for a period of time and then cycle off. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, the analogy I use is echinacea is like putting your pedal on, putting your foot on the pedal, right? You're stepping on the gas,
Right.
but it's not adding more gas to your tank, right?
Gotcha.
So the medicinal mushrooms and the astragalus in terms of herbs, and then again, like just, good food and sleeping and all and fulfillment, emotional well-being are what actually fill the gas tank. So you've got to do both. If somebody is really immune depleted using stimulant herbs like echinacea, if there's no gas in the tank, you can press that pedal all you want, right?
Would you use nutritional approaches there as well, like outside of the herbal world? Like, would you recommend higher dosages of vitamin C during a period of time, or?
Oh, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So vitamin C, I like, certainly there are natural sources, whether it's rose hips, amla fruit, fruits in general. But if you're supplementing ascorbic acid, which is vitamin C, taking that along with bioflavonoids makes it more bioavailable.
Mm-hmm.
But you absolutely, vitamin C, vitamin D, crucial. We're learning more and more about vitamin D's interplay with the immune system. But if I work with someone with Lyme, if they don't know their vitamin D levels, I'll put them on a high but conservative, not a mega dose, but a higher dose of vitamin D, something like 4,000 IUs a day. But I'll recommend they get tested and let's see, because if they're depleted in vitamin D, they're going to be more susceptible to a range of infections, not just Lyme, but definitely Lyme as well. And like I was mentioning earlier, an anti-inflammatory diet for sure. So bumping up healthy fats and omega-3s, both plant-based and animal-based, depending on someone's approach to diet. And for some people, removing nightshades or gluten from the diet. Other people, that makes no difference, but we might try some of those things to see if in that case somebody's sensitive to those. So yeah, definitely looking at those foods that help nourish, detox. Raw fresh garlic, incredibly helpful as part of the Lyme approach, but the alliums like onions, leeks, shallots, etc., in general, both cooked and raw, are helpful for supplying sulfur for glutathione production. So good antioxidant and liver detox, and as part of phase 2 liver metabolism. Same thing with the cruciferous vegetables, always cooked in this case, but kale, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, broccoli are good foods to support healthy detox as well. So yeah, diet and food's super important for sure.
Yeah, let food be thy medicine, said Hippocrates 2,500 years ago.
Absolutely. He said some good things like first do no harm. He was right on with that one too. Not always paid attention to, but
it's amazing how much the ancients knew about this. And we look at them as being the primals.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And just to add one more thing, when we're talking about foods, I mentioned the mushrooms. If somebody, it all depends somebody's situation. If they need something more convenient in the form of capsules or extracts or incorporating into food, somebody living alone and depleted, they may not have the energy to be able to do that. So you work with somebody where they're at. But if you have a bowl of good, strong shiitake broth every day, you throw some burdock root in there, you throw some healthy organic seaweeds in there, that's medicine. And that's going to be long-term incredibly nourishing and restorative.
And you would make shiitake broth the same way you'd make any other type of broth, like bone broth, right? You just same type of method.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You could throw them in together for that matter.
Awesome. Let's talk a little bit about prevention in as so much as repellent. Do those work?
To a point. Ticks are little tanks. So I don't think there's anything natural that 100% is going to keep the ticks off of you. That said, there are things that help. And, I have a little recipe I've come up with that has 3 different essential oils in it. People have different recipes. I'd be happy to share that with you I don't know if you post anything for like as additional materials related to the podcast, but I'd be happy to send that to you.
Yeah,
Or
please do. I can put it in the show notes.
yeah, I'd be happy to. And essentially the 3 essential oils that are in the mix of that I use are Nootka spruce is one, catnip is another, interestingly, and lemon eucalyptus, which is a specific species of eucalyptus. It's not lemon combined with eucalyptus. And all 3 of those have been shown to be very effective at helping keep ticks away. That said, I don't rely on that. I will also still do that tick check at the end of the day, but it definitely does help for sure.
And the tick check ultimately is the biggest preventative element, correct? I mean, it's like, of course, because if you see it, just take it off and remove it. And so if you remove it in a timely fashion, let's say you see it within 24 hours, are you going to be pretty good? Or could you still be infected at that point?
You can be. If you get a tick the same day, if you've been out for the day, go on a nice hike. My wife and I went on this great hike, northwestern New Jersey yesterday. Right at the end of the day, you check each other and make sure there's nothing there. If it's same day, the probability of Lyme transmission is very, very low. It's not 0, but it's very, very low. So, you'll read all sorts of stuff online from 36 hours to 15 to no, it can happen much more quickly. It's about probabilities, not there being a magic number. The point being, the earlier the better. And if it's same day, you're in pretty good shape in terms of the probability. I'm not going to say it never happens, but what my wife and I will often do is do a tick check at the end of the day. And then in the morning light, we'll often say, well, let's do another one just to make sure we didn't miss anything last night. And just play it safe that way and don't skip on that, because I do think that's a really important tool we've got.
And what about ticks getting in the hair? Is that much harder to find, or is that something you have to just in a tactile way, feel with your own hands?
It is much harder. Luckily, it's not about it being 0, but it's not their preferred place.
So they're not likely to go on the head.
They're much less likely. They really like soft, tender, warm spots. They like crevices. They like crotches. They like bellies. They
armpits.
Like underarms. Right, exactly. They like behind your ears or the back of your neck or
behind the knee.
So yeah, exactly. Those are the likely places. So it's not never on the scalp, but I think in general, it's just, it's not soft and inviting for them, thankfully.
And if you see one and you have big hands like I do, and you don't have tweezers on you, like what's a good strategy for trying to remove it?
Oh, well, try to carry tweezers in your backpack when you're hiking, or make sure you have some at home. The main thing you want to do is pull the tick off without squeezing on the body of the tick, because there's at least some indication that the Lyme will travel up from the tick's gut. And there's some indication that if we squeeze on the tick body, we might actually be helping pump that out into our own blood. So you ideally really do want a pair of tweezers, get right down to that tick's head, and at a good perpendicular angle, pull that out. And
will it always come out successfully, or will the head separate sometimes?
Sometimes that happens. The truth is, if you got the bulk of the body out, that is where the Lyme originates. You're probably in pretty good shape in terms of that. Now, you do want to try to get all of it out. And there are tick removal tools that can do a better job even than the tweezers. So picking up one of those is helpful too.
Oh, that's good to know. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I will look that up as well. I had somebody tell me a while ago, I'd be very curious to know what your feeling is on this. They saw one, they couldn't get it out with their fingers. They took a match to it and they took a hit, because that burned that section of the body, but they were hoping that it would burn the tick. Is there any value in that at all in an emergency?
It's a guess. It's a guessing game. Some people theorize that's helpful. Some people also talk about using echinacea or other herbs to kind of rub on it, or alcohol. Other people theorize, well, maybe that just increases the transmission rate. I don't think we know definitively what that does, for me to be able to say.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And lastly, Richard, would you mind talking through your own chapter of Lyme's a little bit? Like, what did you do once you experienced it?
Oh yeah, sure. Like I mentioned earlier, for myself, that pattern that I've come to see working with other people since then was true for me as well, which is that I was going through some challenges. My dad had passed away. My wife and I were building a house. That was positive, but for anyone who's done something like
Right.
that, it's high stress, right?
Right.
Some of it's good stress, but it's still intense, right? So an intense period of time for myself, and just as it all was coming to a close and my dad had passed away, that's when I contracted Lyme. And again, it's something I see with other folks as well. And for me, looking back on it, I later realized that I had odd neck stiffness, like I was, you know how you feel, James, if you just slept in a bad position and your neck's just all stiff. You're like, oh my God, I
Sure.
was, yeah. So felt like that for several days. Something you can too easily dismiss, but looking back on it, you realize, oh, this was part of the pattern. I had a bit of an odd rash on my neck. It was not a bullseye, but it was an odd rash. I also got kind of irritable, and again, that's more subjective, but that's something I see with Lyme as well. Some of the emotional and cognitive impacts that don't get discussed as much. But then what really happened that made it definitive, that didn't allow me to continue ignoring it, was Bell's palsy. So Bell's palsy is when we've got basically these two small openings, essentially behind our ears on either side of our skull, where we've got a nerve that comes through, and for each side of our face helps, basically those are the nerves that control our facial muscle movement, not sensation of touch, but moving the facial muscles. And Bell's palsy is when that nerve becomes inflamed, becomes pinched and damaged, and you have a facial paralysis. So it happens on one side of the face or another because one of those nerves becomes inflamed and pinched and damaged.
And
So
how long did that take to materialize? You're talking about a couple of weeks, a month?
No, for me it was earlier than that. It was within a week or two, and that's common. Interestingly, when Bell's palsy does occur as a result of Lyme, it's most often earlier on. So in some sense, it's a negative experience, but in another sense, if it helps clue you into what's happening, that can be helpful, and that is what happened with me. So luckily, I knew enough about Lyme at the time to go get a test and to have people to call on. And luckily, I knew enough when the doctor came back with the results and told me I did not have Lyme to know that he was probably wrong. And that's what's sad, is that a lot of people, of course, don't have that knowledge. Why should they? And they just walk away thinking, well, okay, I guess that's not it. But I'm one of the many, many stories out there of someone who was told, nope, that you don't have Lyme. I knew enough, and luckily I was a young herbalist at the time. This is about getting close to 20 years ago now. Just beginning to practice and see clients, or I could call on my former teacher and mentors and had a friend who was an acupuncturist who was familiar with, acupuncture specifically helpful for Bell's palsy. So I was lucky in the sense that I had a resource network and community I could call on to get help. So I did take 3 weeks of antibiotics. It's a story. I'm not sure if you're interested in the details, but I ended up getting just working around the system to get the antibiotics in my own way, if you will, because I knew that this was in all likelihood Lyme and that it was probably very early on in the infection. But I went full tilt with high dose omega-3s and milk thistle for liver detox and methylated B12 to support nervous system health. We hadn't talked about some of those things. All of that can be really important. And dietary approaches, topical approaches, including stinging nettles, but other ointments and salves and massage for the Bell's palsy, herbs that help stimulate nervous system healing, like ginkgo and Chinese sage, and I could go on with the specifics, and at St. John's wort. And then on top of that, a full-on herbal Lyme approach. So I did a very aggressive all the above. I had a very severe case of Bell's palsy. For some people, it's fleeting. They'll have it for a few days, it fades away, and it's kind of distressing when it happens, but doesn't last long. For me, I had to work aggressively at it for well over a year to deal with it. So it was a pretty severe case in that sense.
Are you immune from it once you get it, or can it reoccur? Can you get bitten again and get it all over again?
You can get reinfected. Sometimes I will have people ask me about acquired immunity, and it's possible. It's theoretically possible that you might be immune from the exact strain that you had previously, but there are now 18, 19 or so, last time I looked, recognized strains of Lyme, and it's pretty clear that you're not necessarily immune to all of them, even if perhaps are immune to one of them from a previous infection. So you can't let your guard down just if you've been infected. So I'm very careful about it all, despite the fact of having had it in the past.
And you do spend a lot of time in the woods. That's your life.
Yeah, and one of the things I really make a point of working with people, James, is making sure if they're scared to go outside or go back into the woods to work on that with them. And that can be one of the more challenging and difficult things. But you've been out in the woods a number of times with me, so you know my shtick on it. Like this is what we are. We are biologically creatures of the planet Earth, and to think that we can be fully healthy disassociating ourselves from that, or living in a fear response and staying indoors, that presents its own damage to our psyche and to our well-being. That's very real, in my opinion, and it's very understandable, completely understandable, why somebody who has had Lyme is apprehensive or fearful about getting back into the woods. But I think that's a really important thing to address upfront with folks and talk to them about prevention and tick checks and the healing that comes from forest bathing, right? That comes from getting out there and immersing ourselves that way. So that's one of the more unfortunate things that it can, again, understandably cause is a fear of nature and of the outdoors, and it's something to really help people work through.
Is there a fatality rate associated with Lyme's, or do most people live with it?
There are cases where it can get severe enough that it can contribute to fatality from often cardiovascular impact, sometimes liver impact. Those are the most extreme and much more rare cases to happen. But but they're not the norm. But what it can more commonly do is impact someone's quality of life to the point where they can't effectively work anymore, or they can't effectively get out and do the things that fulfill them anymore. And one of the most gratifying things is if I do work with somebody and they kind of stay the course and are on for the ride, so to speak, because it can take a while if someone starts out really depleted, is to see somebody start to bounce back. And you have to pace it, because it can be tempting, like, oh my God, I feel great today. I haven't felt this good in a while. And then, you go for your 15-mile hike. It's like, no, don't do that. Take it easy. Go for a 3-mile hike and build back up slowly. But that's a wonderful thing to see, to see people come back.
Right. Richard, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to throw it back to you. Is there anything else you'd like to cover that we haven't discussed so far?
This has been pretty comprehensive, James. So one thing I'd say, which I've alluded to a couple times, is if there's anyone listening, either if it's yourselves or somebody who's dealing with this, there are a lot of good practitioners out there. Get some help, get some guidance, and in particular, one thing that gets mentioned far too infrequently is people feeling like they may be losing their minds who have Lyme, who feel that it's taken over their thoughts. They no longer feel like themselves. If you're feeling that way, it's not you. Like it is part of this, and that can be a really scary part of this. For some people, even harder to address than the physical symptoms, even if the physical symptoms are debilitating. If somebody feels like they might be losing their mind, and not enough people talk about this, so people get very scared by it, as they should be, as any of us would be. But that is something that Lyme can do as well, and there are ways to address that and come back from that.
Is that mental component part of every Lyme diagnosis, or only within a certain percentage of people?
It's not everyone, but I'll tell you, it's something I started paying attention. I'm not the only one who talks about this, but there aren't enough people who talk about it. I sort of had to find other people who were noticing this too. I started noticing it just on my own, observing clients. And I'll tell you, even in the past month, I've had several people tell me something like this. It's very specific. People will say that they feel possessed. They feel like they can feel the Lyme take over their mind. They don't feel like themselves anymore.
They don't have control of their thoughts, kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's a very peculiar thing, and something I just started noticing. One person after another. Certainly not everybody, to answer your question, but enough people that it became clear that it was not a coincidence. It wasn't random. This is one of the ways that Lyme can affect some people.
And you said you're seeing more of it in your practice, correct?
Yeah, and it's hard to say. Some of that might be word of mouth and people are knowing more that it's something I work with. But this year especially, it was a tick-heavy year, a tick-heavy season, especially the spring. But it does seem to be, and the statistics bear this out, something that really is spreading and increasing, unfortunately.
And with global warming, we could expect it to, I've heard reports of people getting it like in November, like early December in some case, in this area, in the Northeast.
Yep. I know someone where, at least my suspicion is, they were living in an apartment in New York City and probably got it from the Christmas tree they bought and brought into the apartment, because it was during, I don't know if you remember, I forget if it was something like 5 years ago, we had an incredibly warm time of year right around Christmas and New Year's, where it was like 60, 65 degrees, really unusually warm. Alarmingly warm. And so all sorts of, the ticks will wake up along with all sorts of other things when we start getting weather like that.
We had that last year, I remember, because I'm exercising outdoors throughout the year. And I certainly remember one time in December last year, like being out in shorts and a t-shirt and sweating. So how does that work then? So the ticks will resurrect And then what if it gets warm and then it gets cold again? Do they go back, or do they just keep adapting to whatever weather pattern occurs?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. I'm not sure I know the full answer to that, but yeah, they will basically wait out the winter in their adult stage, and if we do get a warm spell, they'll wake up and start moving about for sure. So the other impact with climate change is that it's just staying warm much later into the fall. So some of the biologists that are tracking the tick population are noticing that there many years there's another full, complete reproductive cycle, another complete generation of ticks each year than there used to be, because we're just having warm weather, often into, we don't get a frost now, depending on where you live, maybe it's not till the end of October instead of the end of September or something like that.
Right. And I think last statistic I read was approximately 300,000 people in the U.S. are affected with this a year. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that probably is. It's a very contentious kind of number, as you can imagine, that people disagree on, but it's up there. It's up there in that range. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Richard. Well, again, thank you so much for your time. How can people reach out to you? What's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, my contact information is on my website, and that's just my full name. If you've got show notes, you could put a link in there, but it's richardmandelbaum.com. I appreciate technology, but I avoid social media.
Okay.
So that's my own personal choice for my own well-being. But but certainly people can reach out to me, and I've got other things posted on my website as well related to Lyme that people can check out as well.
And you run a school, right? And with that, could they find out information about that on your website as well?
Absolutely, yeah. So Arbor Vitae, the Arbor Vitae School of Traditional Herbalism, which is in Brooklyn, in New York City, and that's a 3-year clinical program. We've got a free clinic, as well as training for future practitioners, and people could Google that, or absolutely, there's a link on my website as well.
Okay, and that's based out of Brooklyn, but you're doing a lot of that virtually right now, correct?
Yeah, certainly during COVID, we've moved online, but we have a strong in-person component that we're, fingers crossed, hoping to get back to.
Right. And finally, and I should have asked you this in the beginning, real quick, what got you into herbalism?
Yeah, it wasn't my guidance counselor in high school. For me, it was really a reconnection with the natural world. I became interested in trees as a teenager, and learning to identify trees and then plants in general, along with birds and other things we share the planet with. And from there, long story short, got interested in gardening, organic gardening, and foraging for wild foods, and eventually found my way to herbal medicine, using the plants as medicine to promote healing and health. So that was the journey for myself.
Right. Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for your time. Yes, your website will be up on the screen so people could see that, and love to have you on again, cover another health-related topic.
Yeah, thanks so much, James. I would love to come back anytime, and thank you for this, and I hope to see you sometime soon.
Yeah, no, we hope to be back on the trials with you sooner than later.
Yeah, take care.
All right, you too, Richard. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.